In this segment, we're going to talk about a model for span-based reading comprehension called the Attentive reader. What we have here is a little bit of a hodgepodge of a few different methods. We've included a couple of different paper references for this so you can get an idea of what people are doing, but we've tried to distill down the sort of core ideas behind some of these different methods into something that's relatively simple and has all the main components. All right, so what we take in as input is a passage P and a question Q. And these are each going to be, so P is going to consist of words P1 through Pn, and Q is going to consist of words Q1 through Qm. And so notice these are different, and that's because they're not tied in length in any way. The passage can generally be quite long. It might be 1,000 words long, and the question is going to be a question, so maybe 10 to 20 words at most. All right, so the first step of the Attentive reader is encode question into a vector. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use an LSTM for this. And the output hidden state at the last time step, after reading the whole question, we're going to call this Q. And that is going to be our question representation going forward. So the question consists of this sequence of Qs. We're going to cook that down into a vector, and that's what we're going to use for the rest of the operations in the model. All right. Then we encode the passage into P1 through Pn. So at the end of the day, what we're going to need to do is produce a distribution over possible answer locations. So it wouldn't make sense to cook the whole passage down into a single vector, because then how do we make reference to individual positions in it? So instead, what we're going to do is use a by LSTM to turn the passage into a set of vectors, one associated with each word in the passage. So let me show you what that looks like here. So this we talked about back when we dealt with recurrent neural networks. And so mostly for machine translation and related tasks, we were looking at LSTMs and RNNs that look like this, where everything kind of goes in one direction. But we also talked about how it's possible to have another model going in the reverse direction, and that allows us to model that allows us to basically capture each word's following context in addition to the context that comes before it. So we're going to draw that like this. And then each of these cells produces an output, and we combine the two outputs at each time step to get a vector, and this is what we call PI for each possible position token. Okay, so basically for each word now, we've mapped it into a context-aware vector. And now we want to predict start and end positions of the answer. So the way to think about this is that we have this set of vectors. I'm just gonna call these PI. And we have this vector Q. And what we want to do is we want to turn this into a distribution based on where it seems like Q is answered in the passage. And so this looks like something that we've seen before. And what it looks like is attention. Remember that in attention, what we did was we had our encoder for machine translation, and then we had, in our decoder, we had a hidden state, which we then used to kind of query the encoder at each step and form a distribution over the states of the encoder. And so we can do something very similar here, even though this is not an encoder-decoder model. What we can do is say, all right, we want to compare Q with each of these positions. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to compute a vector alpha, which we're going to write as a softmax over I Q transpose W P sub I. So this is exactly our bilinear attention mechanism that we talked about back when we discussed attention. So we talked about there's different functions that you can use. There's you could just take the dot product between Q and P. You can put them through a one-layer neural net, etc. There's different options here, but this is a way of computing a score through Q transpose WP for each I. And then by softmaxing over those, we get a distribution over over kind of probabilities at each time step. All right, so now in order to actually in order to actually predict both a start and an end, what we're going to do is we're going to call this W start, and then I'm going to have another distribution which I'll call beta, which is also going to be a softmax over I of Q transpose W end PI. So these are just two different matrices here that allow us to determine kind of distinct, like basically they allow us to focus on different aspects of the encoded question and passage. And they're going to be trained differently because one is going to be trained to capture the start state, and the other is going to be trained to capture the end state. And so through these different parameters, ideally we're going to access different parts of the Q and P representations and learn the right, the right probability distributions over the token indices. So what I will say as well is that this can work for multiple choice questions as well. So there's a number of QA data sets that are in a multiple choice format. And typically what you do there is you take, you take P and then Q and then answer options, which we'll call O. And you're going to want to use some sort of attention, some basically mix of attention and some final layer that's going to look at the different possible answer options and compare them to the question in the passage. So that's something which shows up in other data sets. And I guess what I want to emphasize is that the span extraction paradigm doesn't really constrain us too heavily. And most of the architectural improvements that we're going to make to this can transfer to settings like multiple choice as well. All right, so that basically tells us that gives us a model, right? So if we have settings of these parameters, so we have kind of one. So we'll write the parameters in red. We have one LSTM here. We have one by LSTM, and we have W start and W end. So it's a fairly complicated neural net structure, but it consists of pieces that we've seen before. So we're just stapling these things together, and I guess take my word for it that in something like PyTorch, this isn't too bad if you have access to all the standard library functions. All right, so I want to show you basically what these distributions look like. So we have some examples here from SQUAD, the Stanford Question Answering Dataset, which is a dataset consisting of kind of short factual questions like this and short associated passages. So for example, we have who caught a 16-yard pass on this drive, Devin Funchess, and the start distribution, interestingly, places probability mass on two options here, Devin and also Stewart. Now notice that the model has successfully identified that there was a 16-yard reception here. And so probably the fact that there was something going for 16 yards was very important for the model to zero in on this, but then it's not actually sure who in the sentence is responsible for it. But then the end distribution is very confident that it's Stewart. Okay, so this is not correct. The model got this one wrong. But you can see that even though it was wrong, it at least zeroed in on people in the right sentence and was kind of roughly, with the combination of these span, start, and end distributions, kind of placing probability mass in reasonable places. All right, let's look at one that works a little bit better. Where did Luther spend his career? University of Wittenberg. And so in this case, you could see the start and end distribution. The start distribution sort of likes Wittenberg, it very much likes university, and then the end distribution places all of its mass on Wittenberg. You can't even read it there. And so again, when we search over to find the span that has the highest start times end probability, we're going to pick out these as the end points, and then the final span we're going to get is going to be University of Wittenberg, and that's the right answer. And then just a final example, what group specifically opposed the Huguenots, the Catholic Church in France? This is a little bit of a trickier question because the answer is an organization here rather than just like a location or a person, and that might be a little bit harder for the model to find. So you see a flatter distribution over Catholic Church in France, French Catholics, and then the end distribution kind of looks at both members and Catholics here. So the model here is going to pick out, well, it's a little bit hard to tell without actually seeing the numbers here. But what the model returns is it returns Catholic Church in France and many of its members. So again, not quite the right output according to what the specified answer is, but actually a very good answer. So this gives you a sense, I think, of both what the model is kind of able to do and what these distributions look like. And we can, I think, get a sense of why this might work well. If you boil the question down to thinking about groups and Huguenots and things like that, then the model will say, oh, okay, here was some nearby Huguenot stuff. This thing looks like a group. So that's probably going to be somewhere where I'm going to place a high start probability mass. That's kind of roughly the process the model is going through and how you should be thinking about what it's doing. So this gives you an idea of how this basic attentive reader model works. I'll say that this model does not actually work all that well. We're going to need a couple of improvements to make it at least passably good, and then we'll talk about kind of fancier stuff going forward from there. But that's the end of this segment.